In October 2010, a nurse at Beth Israel Medical Center walked past room 3K, as she had done nearly every day for 2 decades. Inside, a 104-year-old woman sat surrounded by medical equipment she didn't need, attended by staff who treated no illness, in a space that cost roughly $400,000 per year to maintain. Huguette Clark had not been sick when she arrived. She had not been sick for most of the 7,300 days she had spent there. She had simply decided in 1991 that this room was safer than the Fifth Avenue apartment she owned, the California oceanfront estate she maintained, or the Connecticut mansion, slowly rotting in her absence. When asked why she stayed, she offered no reason. When asked if she wanted to go home, she said she was already there. The story of Huguette Clark is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. No catastrophe forced her withdrawal. No scandal drove her into hiding. She inherited one of America's largest fortunes, built by her father from Montana copper mines and political machinery, and spent 8 decades converting wealth into distance. By the time she died in 2011, she had not been photographed in nearly 70 years, had not seen most of her properties in half a century, and had spoken to almost no one outside a shrinking circle of employees who became, by default, her only human contact. What she was hiding from, or what she believed she was protecting, remains unclear. What is certain is that she spent her entire adult life constructing a world where she would never have to be seen. This is where that world began. Huguette Marcelle Clark was born on June 9, 1906, in Paris, in a rented mansion her parents occupied to avoid the social scrutiny waiting for them in New York. Her father, William Andrews Clark, was 70 years old. Her mother, Anna Eugenia LaChapelle, was 23 years younger than him and had been his ward before becoming his wife. The birth took place in France because Anna had insisted on it, not out of affection for Paris, but because she understood that New York society would not easily forgive what had come before. W. Clark was, by 1906, one of the 5 wealthiest men in America. He had extracted his fortune from the Butte copper mines in Montana, using methods that included bribing state legislators, controlling newspapers, and deploying private armed forces against labor organizers. In 1899, he bribed his way into the United States Senate, a fact so transparent that the Senate conducted an investigation and forced his resignation within 2 years. He returned to Montana, bribed a different set of legislators, and won the seat again in 1901. This time, the Senate allowed him to stay. His wealth, estimated between $150 and $200 million, purchased silence more effectively than respectability. Anna had entered Clark's household in 1893, shortly after the death of his first wife, Catherine. She arrived as a young woman from Michigan who played the harp and spoke French, hired ostensibly to tutor Clark's children from his first marriage. Within a year, she had moved into a private suite in his New York mansion. Within 3 years, she was traveling with him to Europe as his companion. They married in Marseille in 1901 quietly, with no family present. By the time they announced the marriage, Anna was already pregnant with their first daughter, Andrée. Catherine Clark, the first wife, had given W. Clark 6 children. 4 survived to adulthood. When Anna entered the house, those children were not yet grown. They watched their father's young ward move through the rooms their mother had occupied, taking meals at her table, wearing jewelry from her collection. Mary, the eldest daughter, would later refuse to speak to Anna for the rest of her life. Charlie, the eldest son, tolerated her presence but made no effort to include her in family affairs. The children from the first marriage understood what Anna was long before New York society did: a replacement, not a widow's successor. Andrée, Anna's first daughter, was born in 1902. She was delicate, prone to respiratory illness, and required constant medical attention. Anna focused entirely on her care, often keeping her indoors for months at a time. Huguette arrived 4 years later, healthy and robust in comparison, but by then the family's rhythm had already been set. Anna's world revolved around Andrée. W. Clark's world revolved around his business empire, his art collection, and his Senate seat. Huguette was raised primarily by governesses in houses that changed with the seasons: Fifth Avenue in winter, a chateau in France in spring, Santa Barbara in summer. She learned French before English. She took harp lessons like her mother, piano lessons from private tutors, painting lessons from instructors hired for the season. She was taught to move quietly through rooms, to speak only when addressed, to understand that her father's time was allocated according to importance, and children were rarely important. When W.A. Clark was home, he was either in his library or in his gallery, surrounded by paintings he had acquired in Europe, Renoir, Corot, Monet, which he catalogued with the same precision he had once used to document copper ore shipments. Anna did not push Huguette into public view. There were no portraits commissioned, no society announcements, no photographs distributed to the press. The family appeared occasionally at the opera or at gallery openings, but Anna kept both daughters close, never allowing them to wander into the crowd. New York society pages noted the Clarks' presence but rarely described them in detail. Huguette, in particular, seemed to exist only as a name in passing. Mr. and Mrs. W. Clark and daughters, with no further elaboration. In 1910, W. A. Clark began construction on a mansion at 962 Fifth Avenue, between 77th and 78th Streets. It would take 9 years to complete. The house occupied an entire block, 121 rooms spread across 4 floors, with a basement swimming pool, a gallery designed to hold over 200 paintings, and a private theater. The cost exceeded $7 million, roughly $200 million in modern currency, and Clark insisted on overseeing every detail. He selected the marble himself, traveling to quarries in Italy to inspect the stone. He hired French craftsmen to carve the wood paneling. He installed a pipe organ that required its own dedicated room. Huguette was 4 when construction began. She would be 13 when the house was finished. By the time her family moved in, the mansion had already become obsolete. New York society was shifting away from Gilded Age excess, and the block-sized palace was regarded as a monument to vulgarity rather than taste. But W.A. Clark did not build it for society. He built it because he could, and because ownership of beauty was the only form of respectability he understood how to purchase. André's health worsened in 1914. She developed meningitis and spent months confined to bed, attended by rotating nurses. Huguette, then 8 years old, was not allowed into her sister's room. Anna sat with André for hours each day, reading to her, playing music, maintaining a vigil that left little attention for anyone else. On October 15, 1919, André died at the age of 16. The cause was listed as meningitis, though some accounts suggested complications from typhoid fever. The family held a small private funeral. W.A. Clark, 80 years old and showing signs of heart trouble, did not speak at the service. After André's death, Anna stopped leaving the house for months at a time. She kept André's room unchanged, the bed made, the curtains drawn, the door closed. Huguette, now 13, became the sole focus of her mother's attention, not in the way a child might wish, but in the way a replacement is maintained. Anna began dressing Huguette in styles similar to what André had worn. She insisted Huguette continue the harp lessons André had abandoned. She spoke about André constantly, in present tense, as though the older daughter had simply moved to another room. W.A. Clark's health declined steadily after 1920. He suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his left side. He could no longer walk without assistance, could no longer travel to his Montana properties, could no longer oversee his business empire with the obsessive control he had maintained for 50 years. He spent his final years in the Fifth Avenue mansion, moving slowly through the gallery he had built, looking at paintings he had purchased decades earlier. He stopped acquiring new art. He stopped attending the opera. He stopped receiving visitors except for lawyers and accountants who came to discuss estate planning. Huguette saw him rarely. When she did, he was either asleep or too exhausted to speak. She would later tell one of her nurses that she remembered him as a very old man who lived in the big house, not as a father. He died on March 2nd, 1925, at the age of 86, in his bedroom on the 2nd floor. The funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Huguette, 18 years old, attended in a black veil that covered her face entirely. She did not speak to the press. She did not speak to her half-siblings from her father's first marriage, who attended the service but left immediately afterward. When the will was read, it became clear that W.A. Clark had divided his empire carefully. His children from the first marriage received business assets and properties, while Anna and Huguette received cash, art, and the Fifth Avenue mansion. The separation was deliberate. He had built two families, and he made sure they would never have to speak to each other again. W.A. Clark had purchased the Santa Barbara property in 1923, 2 years before his death, though he would never live there long enough to call it home. The estate sat on 23 acres overlooking the Pacific, accessible only by a narrow private road that wound up through eucalyptus groves and coastal scrub. He named it Bello Sguardo, beautiful lookout in Italian, and spent $3 million constructing a main house, guest cottages, gardens, and a private railway spur that connected the property to the Santa Barbara depot. The architecture was Mediterranean Revival, white stucco walls and red tile roofs, designed by an architect who had previously worked on Spanish missions. Clark visited the site 3 times during construction, inspecting the stonework and approving the placement of imported Italian fountains. He spent a total of 6 weeks there before his stroke made travel impossible. Anna and Huguette first stayed at Bello Sguardo in the summer of 1925, 4 months after W.A.'s death. Anna had insisted they leave New York. The Fifth Avenue mansion felt too large, too full of silence that had once been her husband's presence. She wanted distance from the city, from the half-siblings who had made clear they considered her an interloper, from the society pages that still occasionally mentioned the Clark family in contexts Anna found uncomfortable. Santa Barbara offered isolation without the appearance of retreat. The estate was grand enough to maintain status, remote enough to avoid scrutiny. The main house contained 22 rooms, but Anna and Huguette used only 5 of them. The formal dining room remained closed, its table set with china that was never touched. The ballroom was locked. The library, filled with books W.A. had purchased but never read, gathered dust behind drawn curtains. Anna established a routine immediately: breakfast in the morning room, afternoons in the garden, evenings in the music room where Huguette practiced harp, while Anna sat in silence, hands folded, staring at the ocean visible through the windows. They brought no guests. The estate employed a staff of 12, gardeners, housekeepers, a cook, a chauffeur, but Anna instructed them to maintain distance. Meals were delivered to the morning room on trays. Housekeeping occurred only when Anna and Huguette were outside. The staff lived in separate cottages at the edge of the property and were told not to approach the main house unless summoned. One gardener, hired in 1926, would later recall that he worked at Bello Sguardo for 3 years and never once saw Huguette's face. She moved through the gardens wearing wide-brimmed hats that obscured her features, always at a distance, always turning away when staff approached. Huguette painted. She set up an easel on the terrace overlooking the ocean and worked in watercolors, copying images from art books Anna had brought from New York. She painted landscapes she had never visited: French villages, Venetian canals, Japanese gardens. She never painted the view in front of her. When asked why, she told her mother she preferred subjects that required imagination rather than observation. Anna did not press the question. The gardens at Bello Sguardo were elaborate: terraced lawns, rose beds, reflecting pools, walking paths lined with imported palm trees. W.A. Clark had hired a landscape architect to design them according to principles he had observed in Italian villas, with strict geometric layouts and controlled sightlines. The maintenance required constant work. The staff pruned, watered, replanted, and trimmed according to schedules that dictated every task down to the hour. Huguette walked through the gardens but never stopped to examine them closely. She moved along the paths as though completing a circuit, returning to the house at the same time each day. The beauty surrounding her was maintained for its own sake, not for hers. In 1927, Anna decided they should spend the entire year at Bello Sguardo rather than returning to New York for the winter season. She gave no explanation for the decision, but the effect was immediate. Whatever minimal social contact Huguette had maintained in New York disappeared entirely. There were no more opera performances, no more gallery openings, no more carefully orchestrated appearances at events Anna deemed acceptable. Santa Barbara society occasionally extended invitations, garden parties, charity luncheons, musicales, but Anna declined them all. She told acquaintances that Huguette's health required rest and quiet, though Huguette showed no signs of illness. Huguette turned 21 in 1927. Under the terms of her father's will, she gained direct access to her inheritance, approximately $20 million in cash and securities, equivalent to roughly $300 million today. She also inherited a portion of W.A.'s art collection, including several Renoir paintings and a Stradivarius violin she did not play. The lawyers handling the estate sent documents to Bellosguardo for her signature. She signed them without reading the details, then asked Anna what she was supposed to do with the money. Anna told her it would be managed by the same accountants who had handled W.A.'s affairs. Huguette asked no further questions. The wealth existed as abstraction. Huguette never saw account statements, never made investment decisions, never expressed interest in how the money functioned or grew. She knew the staff at Bellosguardo were paid, the property was maintained, and her personal expenses were covered. She bought art supplies, fabric for dressmaking, music books, and an expensive collection of French fashion dolls that arrived by mail from Paris. The dolls came with elaborate wardrobes, hand-stitched gowns, miniature jewelry, leather shoes. Huguette spent hours dressing and undressing them, arranging them on shelves in her bedroom, creating scenes, a ballroom dance, a garden party, a wedding, that she would then dismantle and rebuild with different configurations. Anna watched this without comment. She had begun spending her own days in near total stillness, sitting in the morning room with a book open in her lap, though she rarely turned the pages. She wrote letters occasionally to lawyers in New York or to a cousin in France, but she initiated no new correspondence. She stopped subscribing to newspapers. She stopped asking the staff for news from outside the estate. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, wiping out fortunes across the country, Anna learned about it 3 weeks later from an accountant's letter. She read the letter, folded it carefully, and told Huguette that their investments had not been affected. Huguette asked if that was good. Anna said yes, then changed the subject. The estate began to feel less like a residence and more like a preservation site. Rooms were cleaned, but not used. Furniture was polished, but not sat in. The formal gardens were maintained with obsessive precision, but no one walked through them except Huguette on her daily circuit and the staff during their work hours. The fountains ran constantly, their water recycled through underground pipes, creating the illusion of life and movement in a place where nothing actually moved. In 1930, a journalist from the Santa Barbara News Press requested an interview with Huguette, noting that she was one of the wealthiest young women in California and had never been profiled in the press. Anna refused on Huguette's behalf. The journalist wrote a brief article anyway, based on secondhand accounts from townspeople who had glimpsed the Clarks at church or driving past in their car. The article described Huguette as reclusive and eccentric, 2 words that would follow her for the rest of her life. Anna read the article, then instructed the staff to stop driving through town. If errands required going into Santa Barbara, they should be completed by staff members alone, with no family present. Huguette did not object. She had long since stopped asking to go anywhere. When Anna suggested they take a trip to France, Huguette said she preferred to stay at Bellosguardo. When Anna proposed inviting distant relatives to visit, Huguette said she did not think that was necessary. She had settled into a life where the elimination of possibility felt safer than its presence. Bellosguardo offered her everything she seemed to want: beauty she did not have to engage with, space she did not have to fill, and a mother who required nothing from her except continued existence in the same house. The ocean stretched out beyond the terrace, vast and unchanging. Huguette could see it from her bedroom window, from the music room, from the garden paths. She looked at it often but never walked down to the beach. The estate's boundaries ended at the cliff edge, and below that was public land, accessible to anyone. She stayed within the gates, where the view remained distant and the water stayed exactly where it belonged. Anna decided in early 1928 that Huguette should be introduced to New York society. The decision came without warning and without explanation. For 3 years, they had lived in near total seclusion at Bellosguardo, establishing patterns that seemed permanent. Then in February, Anna announced they would return to the Fifth Avenue mansion for the social season. Huguette, 21 years old, asked why. Anna said it was expected. Huguette asked by whom. Anna did not answer. They arrived in New York in March, and the mansion had been prepared for their return. Dust covers removed, windows opened, staff reassembled from the skeleton crew that had maintained the property in their absence. The house still felt cavernous. Of the 121 rooms, they occupied the same small cluster they had used before. Anna's bedroom suite on the second floor, Huguette's adjoining room, a sitting room where they took meals, and the music room where Huguette practiced. The rest remained closed. The gallery, filled with W.A.'s paintings, was kept locked. The ballroom, designed for entertaining hundreds, had never been used and showed no signs it ever would be. Anna hired a social secretary, a woman named Mrs. Harriet Thompson, who had previously worked for the Vanderbilts. Mrs. Thompson's job was to navigate the complex protocols of New York society on Huguette's behalf, to determine which invitations were acceptable, which families were appropriate to associate with, and how to manage Huguette's debut without attracting the kind of attention that might invite questions about the Clark family's past. Mrs. Thompson understood immediately that this would be difficult. Huguette had no social history, no established friendships, and no apparent interest in acquiring either. She had also inherited her father's reputation, and while wealth could purchase access, it could not erase what W.A. Clark had done to obtain it. The debut season required a series of carefully orchestrated appearances. First, there would be a tea at the mansion, hosted by Anna introducing Huguette to a select group of young women from established families. Then a small dinner with appropriate young men, sons of families whose finances were secure enough that they would not appear to be fortune hunters. Finally, attendance at several balls and charity events where Huguette would be seen, photographed, and evaluated by the same society that had never fully accepted her father. The tea was held on April 12, 1928. Anna invited 16 young women, all between the ages of 19 and 23, all from families listed in the social register. They arrived at 3 o'clock, dressed in afternoon gowns and gloves, and were escorted to the drawing room where Anna and Huguette waited. The room had been prepared with elaborate flower arrangements and a table set with French porcelain. Huguette wore a pale blue dress that Anna had selected, her hair styled in the Marcel wave that was fashionable that season. She stood near the fireplace, hands clasped in front of her, and said nothing while Anna greeted each guest by name. The young women made polite conversation. They asked Huguette about her interests. She said she painted and played the harp. They asked if she had traveled. She said she had been to France as a child, but did not remember it well. They asked about Bellosguardo, which several of them had read about in society columns. She said it was quiet. One of the young women, whose name Huguette would not later recall, suggested they should all visit Santa Barbara together in the summer. Huguette smiled and said nothing. The tea lasted 90 minutes. When the guests left, Anna told Huguette she had done well. Huguette went upstairs to her room and did not come down for dinner. The dinner, held 2 weeks later, was worse. Anna invited 8 young men carefully selected for their social standing and lack of financial desperation. They arrived at 7 o'clock and dinner was served in the formal dining room, the first time the room had been used since W.A.'s death. The table seated 24, so the 10 people present, Anna, Huguette, the 8 men, were spread out according to a seating chart Mrs. Thompson had devised to prevent awkward silences. It did not work. Conversation stalled repeatedly. The men attempted topics they assumed would be safe: art, music, travel, and Huguette answered in brief, quiet sentences that discouraged follow-up questions. One young man asked if she enjoyed the theater. She said she had not been. Another asked about her father's art collection. She said she did not know much about it. A third, growing desperate, asked if she liked New York. She said she preferred California. After dinner, Anna suggested they move to the music room so Huguette could play the harp. Huguette looked at her mother but said nothing. They moved to the music room, and Huguette sat at the harp, adjusted the strings, and played a short piece by Gabriel Fauré. She played competently, without obvious errors, but also without expression. Her hands moved through the motions, while her face remained blank. When she finished, the men applauded politely. Anna suggested she play another piece. Huguette said she was tired. The evening ended shortly after 9 o'clock, hours earlier than such events typically concluded. None of the young men contacted Mrs. Thompson to request further introduction. The balls were mandatory. Mrs. Thompson had accepted invitations on Huguette's behalf to 3 major events: the Junior League Ball, the Spring Charity Gala, and the Orchid Ball at the Plaza Hotel. Anna insisted Huguette attend all of them. Huguette said she would prefer not to. Anna said preference was not the issue. They went. The Junior League Ball was held on May 5th at the Ritz-Carlton. Huguette wore a white silk gown that Anna had commissioned from a French designer, with seed pearls embroidered along the neckline and a hem that brushed the floor. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate updo, secured with diamond pins that had belonged to W.A.'s first wife, Catherine. Anna had insisted on the pins, though she did not explain why. They arrived at 10 o'clock, the fashionable late entrance, and were announced by name at the ballroom entrance. Heads turned. Huguette walked beside her mother, eyes fixed on the floor ahead, and took a seat at a table near the edge of the room. Young men approached. The protocol required it. A debutante of Huguette's wealth and family name could not be ignored, regardless of her demeanor. They asked her to dance. She accepted, because refusal would have been a breach of etiquette, too obvious to overlook. She danced stiffly, maintaining the required distance, following the steps correctly, but without engagement. She did not speak during the dances. When the music ended, she returned to her seat immediately. After the fourth dance, she told Anna she felt ill. Anna did not believe her, but allowed them to leave anyway. They were home before midnight. The society pages noted Huguette's presence at the ball, but offered no details beyond her name and her gown. The New York Times mentioned her in a list of attendees, nothing more. The gossip columnists, who had been watching for something scandalous or interesting about the Copper King's daughter, found nothing to write about. She had appeared, fulfilled the minimum requirements, and disappeared. The Spring Charity Gala and the Orchid Ball followed the same pattern. Huguette attended, danced when required, spoke when directly addressed, and left as early as politeness allowed. By the third event, other debutantes had stopped attempting conversation with her. The young men who might have pursued her as a potential match lost interest. Her fortune was appealing, but her complete lack of warmth or social ease made the prospect exhausting. Mrs. Thompson reported to Anna that the debut season had been, by conventional measures, unsuccessful. Huguette had been seen and acknowledged, but she had made no connections, formed no friendships, and attracted no serious romantic interest. Anna thanked Mrs. Thompson for her service and did not renew her contract. In June, Anna and Huguette returned to Bellosguardo. Huguette unpacked her trunks, hung the gowns she had worn in the closet where they would remain untouched, and resumed the routine they had established before leaving. She painted, practiced the harp, arranged her dolls. Anna asked once if she had enjoyed New York. Huguette said no. Anna did not ask again. William MacDonald Gower was 25 years old when he met Huguette Clark in the summer of 1928. He was a law student at Columbia University, the son of a respectable but not wealthy family from New Jersey, and he played tennis at the clubs where young people of a certain class gathered during the summer months. He was introduced to Huguette at a garden party in Southampton, hosted by a family Anna knew distantly through charitable connections. Huguette had not wanted to attend. Anna had insisted, saying they could not spend the entire summer at Bellosguardo without consequence. They went for one afternoon. Gower was tall, presentable, and polite in the unremarkable way that made him acceptable to mothers like Anna. He approached Huguette because someone, likely the hostess, had told him who she was, and young men approaching wealthy young women at garden parties was expected behavior. He asked if she played tennis. She said no. He asked if she enjoyed Southampton. She said she had just arrived. He asked if she would like to walk through the garden. She looked at Anna, who nodded, and they walked. He did most of the talking. He mentioned his studies, his family's home in Inglewood, his plans to practice law in Manhattan after graduation. Huguette listened but offered little in return. When he asked about her interests, she said she painted. When he asked what she painted, she said scenes from books. He seemed unsure how to respond to that, so he changed the subject. They completed one circuit of the garden, returned to where Anna was sitting, and he thanked Huguette for her time. She nodded. He left. Anna asked what she thought of him. Huguette said she had not formed an opinion. Gower began calling at the Fifth Avenue mansion in September, after Huguette and Anna had returned to New York for the fall. The visits followed a formal pattern. He would arrive at 4 o'clock, be received in the drawing room, and spend exactly 1 hour in conversation with Huguette, while Anna sat nearby, ostensibly reading, but clearly monitoring the interaction. He brought flowers on the first visit, then stopped when Huguette thanked him, without looking at them. He asked her questions about art, music, and her time in California, receiving answers that were polite but brief. After the third visit, he asked Anna if he might take Huguette to dinner. Anna said that would be acceptable, provided they were accompanied by a chaperone. The dinners were strained. They went to restaurants Anna approved, quiet, expensive establishments where they would not encounter crowds or attention. Huguette ordered whatever Anna suggested and ate little. Gower attempted conversation but found himself working harder each time to fill the silences. He would later tell his family that Huguette was difficult to know, which was a polite way of saying she showed no interest in being known. But he continued the courtship anyway, because by October it had become clear to everyone involved that this was moving toward marriage, whether Huguette engaged with the process or not. Anna wanted the marriage. She never stated this directly, but her encouragement of Gower's visits, her careful orchestration of appropriate outings, and her increasing pressure on Huguette to participate made the intention obvious. Huguette was 22 years old, had shown no interest in social life, and had no prospects beyond Gower. Anna understood that if this opportunity passed, there might not be another. Gower was not ideal. His family had no fortune, no significant social standing, but he was acceptable, and more importantly, he was willing. That was enough. Gower proposed in December 1928 in the drawing room of the Fifth Avenue mansion, with Anna present. He had requested the meeting formally through a letter delivered by messenger, and Anna had prepared Huguette by telling her what would happen and what her answer should be. When Gower asked the question, Huguette looked at Anna first, then back at him, and said yes. He smiled. She did not. He asked if he could kiss her. She offered her hand instead. He took it, held it briefly, and left to inform his family. The wedding was planned for August 1929. Anna hired a coordinator, selected the Cathedral of the Madeleine in Salt Lake City, a location chosen for its distance from New York society and its lack of press attention, and arranged for a small ceremony with fewer than 30 guests. Huguette was not consulted about the location, the date, or the guest list. When Anna showed her fabric samples for the wedding gown, Huguette said they all looked the same. Anna chose ivory silk with Belgian lace. Gower visited regularly during the engagement, but the visits grew shorter. He would arrive, sit with Huguette for 20 minutes, exchange a few words, and leave. He stopped bringing flowers. He stopped attempting elaborate conversation. He seemed to be fulfilling an obligation rather than anticipating a marriage, and Huguette matched his energy exactly. They were two people moving toward a ceremony neither appeared to want. Propelled by momentum that had nothing to do with them, the wedding took place on August 18, 1929. Huguette wore the ivory gown Anna had selected. Gower wore a mourning suit. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. Huguette's responses were barely audible. When the priest instructed Gower to kiss his bride, he kissed her cheek, and she turned her face away immediately afterward. The reception was held at a hotel Anna had reserved, with a small meal served to the guests in a private dining room. There was champagne, though Huguette did not drink. There was a cake, which neither she nor Gower cut. Anna made a brief toast about happiness and family. No one else spoke. The couple left for a honeymoon in Los Angeles, staying at the Ambassador Hotel for 2 weeks. Gower had suggested Europe, but Anna insisted on California, closer to Bellasguardo in case Huguette wanted to return early. Huguette spent most of the honeymoon in the hotel room. Gower went out during the day, visiting acquaintances he knew in Los Angeles, attending a few social events alone. When he returned, Huguette would be sitting by the window, painting or reading. He asked once if she was happy. She said she did not know. He did not ask again. They returned to New York in September and moved into an apartment Gower had rented on Park Avenue, modest by Clark family standards but appropriate for a young lawyer starting his career. Anna had offered to purchase them a larger residence, but Gower had refused, saying he wanted to provide for his wife himself. The apartment had 5 rooms. Huguette occupied one bedroom. Gower occupied another. The separation was immediate and unspoken. Gower left for work each morning at 8. Huguette stayed in her room painting or arranging the dolls she had brought from the Fifth Avenue mansion. He returned in the evening, and they ate dinner together in silence, prepared by a cook Gower had hired. After dinner, he read legal documents in the sitting room, while Huguette returned to her bedroom. They lived this way for 3 months. In December, Gower told Huguette he thought the marriage was not working. She agreed. He asked if she wanted to try to repair it. She said no. He asked if she had ever wanted to marry him. She said her mother had thought it was appropriate. He asked what she wanted. She said she wanted to go back to Bellosguardo. He filed for divorce in January 1930, citing incompatibility. Huguette did not contest it. Anna hired lawyers to negotiate a settlement. Gower received $50,000 and signed an agreement never to discuss the marriage publicly. The divorce was finalized in Reno, Nevada in June 1930, after the required 6-week residency period. Huguette did not attend the proceedings. She returned to Bellosguardo in July and resumed the life she had left. Anna never mentioned the marriage again. Huguette never mentioned Gower. The ivory wedding gown was packed in tissue paper and stored in a trunk in the Fifth Avenue mansion, where it would remain untouched for the next 80 years. W.A. Clark had been dead for 5 years when the stock market collapsed in October 1929, but his financial structures survived the crash almost entirely intact. He had built his fortune on tangible assets, copper mines, real estate, timber, railroads, and though the value of everything declined, the physical infrastructure remained. His accountants, still managing the family trusts, had diversified carefully, following instructions W.A. had written in 1923 during one of his last periods of lucidity. The Clark fortune lost roughly 20% of its paper value between 1929 and 1933, a fraction of what most wealthy families endured. Anna's income decreased from $500,000 per year to $400,000. Huguette's decreased proportionally. Neither of them noticed. The depression that followed the crash did not reach Bellosguardo in any form Huguette could perceive. The staff remained employed at full wages. The gardens continued to be maintained with the same obsessive precision. The house was cleaned, heated, and supplied with food delivered from Santa Barbara's best grocers. Huguette read about bread lines and bank failures in newspapers Anna occasionally left in the morning room, but the information registered as something happening elsewhere, to other people, in a world that had nothing to do with hers. Anna's health began to decline in 1932. She was 55 years old and had started experiencing chest pain that her doctor attributed to angina. He prescribed rest, a bland diet, and limited exertion. Anna ignored all 3 recommendations. She continued her daily routine, rising at 7, taking breakfast in the morning room, sitting in the garden for exactly 1 hour, returning to the house for lunch, spending afternoons in her suite, and joining Huguette for dinner at 6. The routine was maintained not because it brought her pleasure, but because deviation implied chaos, and chaos was the one thing Anna had spent her entire adult life preventing. Huguette was 26 years old, divorced, living with her mother in a house neither of them used fully. She painted the same subjects she had painted since adolescence: European villages copied from postcards, gardens that existed only in her imagination, interiors of rooms she had never entered. She had developed some technical skill over the years, but her work showed no progression, no experimentation, no evolution. Each painting looked like the one before it. She completed them, stacked them in a closet, and started new ones without ever displaying or discussing what she had made. Her doll collection had grown considerably. She now owned over 200 dolls, most of them antique French bisque dolls with elaborate costumes. She kept them on shelves in her bedroom, arranged by size and style. She changed their clothing regularly, following seasonal patterns. Lighter fabrics in summer, heavier materials in winter. She wrote inventory lists, tracking which doll wore which outfit, which needed repairs, which required new wigs or shoes. The lists were meticulous, running to dozens of pages, maintained in leather-bound notebooks she kept locked in a drawer. She began commissioning custom doll clothing from a seamstress in Paris, sending detailed specifications for gowns, hats, undergarments, and accessories. The orders arrived by mail every few months, carefully packed in wooden boxes. Huguette would spend entire afternoons unpacking them, examining the stitching, trying the garments on different dolls to see which fit best. She wrote letters to the seamstress praising the work and requesting modifications: a different shade of blue, a narrower waist, shorter sleeves. The correspondence continued for years. Huguette never met the seamstress, never visited Paris, never saw the atelier where the clothing was made. The relationship existed entirely through letters and packages, which was exactly how Huguette preferred it. Anna watched this without intervention. She had given up years earlier any expectation that Huguette would develop interests beyond painting and dolls. that she would re-enter society, that she would marry again. The failed marriage to Gower had confirmed what Anna probably already knew. Huguette was not suited for conventional life, and forcing her toward it only produced failure. So Anna stopped forcing. She allowed Huguette to retreat completely, to structure her days around activities that required no interaction with anyone outside the household staff, to live as though the external world had ceased to exist. In 1934, Anna's doctor told her that her heart condition was worsening. He recommended she spend time at a lower altitude, away from the California coast, perhaps in Arizona. Anna refused. She told him Bellasguardo was her home and she would not leave it. He warned her that continued stress and exertion could be fatal. She thanked him for his concern and did not change her behavior. She understood, in a way she did not articulate to anyone, that her presence at Bellasguardo was the only structure keeping Huguette tethered to any form of routine. If she left, even temporarily, Huguette might disappear entirely into the private world she had been constructing for years. The estate itself had begun showing signs of neglect, despite the staff's efforts. The gardens remained immaculate, but the outbuildings, the guest cottages, the garages, the greenhouse, were developing the subtle deterioration that comes from disuse. Paint faded, wood warped, hinges rusted. The structures were inspected and maintained according to schedule, but maintenance could not replicate the vitality that came from actual habitation. The guest cottages, built to house visitors who never came, sat empty year after year. The garages held cars that were driven only for errands. The greenhouse, designed to provide fresh flowers for the main house, grew plants no one looked at. Huguette turned 30 in 1936. Anna organized a small celebration. A cake, a gift of new art supplies, but did not invite anyone outside the household. Huguette thanked her mother and spent the rest of the day in her room. That evening, Anna asked if she was happy. Huguette said she was content. Anna asked if she ever wanted anything different. Huguette said she had everything she needed. Anna did not press further. The conversation was the longest they had had in months. The distance between mother and daughter had solidified into something structural. They lived in the same house, ate meals together, occupied adjacent rooms, but they no longer communicated beyond the logistics of daily life. Anna had become a presence rather than a participant, someone who ensured Huguette's routines were maintained, but who no longer attempted to shape or redirect them. Huguette had become equally passive, moving through days that all resembled each other, with no apparent desire for change or variation. In 1937, Anna suffered a minor stroke that left her bedridden for 6 weeks. Huguette visited her mother's room daily, sitting in a chair near the bed, saying little. Anna, unable to move easily, watched her daughter and seemed to register something she had not allowed herself to see before, that Huguette was not content, not happy, but rather suspended in a state of permanent avoidance. When Anna recovered enough to speak clearly, she asked Huguette if she had been lonely during the weeks Anna was incapacitated. Huguette said no. Anna asked if she had spoken to anyone besides the staff. Huguette said there was no one else to speak to. Anna said nothing more. The Clark fortune continued generating income. Dividends arrived quarterly, deposited into accounts managed by lawyers and accountants in New York. Huguette signed documents when instructed, but never asked about the details. The wealth functioned as a mechanism that sustained the life she and Anna had built at Bellasguardo, a life that required constant funding to maintain its illusion of permanence, but that produced nothing, meant nothing, and led nowhere. By 1938, it was clear that Anna would not live much longer. Her heart condition had progressed to the point where she could barely walk from her bedroom to the morning room without stopping to rest. She refused to hire a nurse, insisting the household staff could manage her care. She continued her routines in abbreviated form, spending most of her time in bed, emerging only for meals with Huguette. The two women sat across from each other in the morning room, eating in silence, while outside the gardens grew and were cut back, in cycles that had long since lost any meaning beyond their own repetition. Anna Eugenia Clark died on October 11, 1963, at the age of 86, in her bedroom at Bellasguardo. She had been bedridden for the final 3 months, attended by a nurse she had finally reluctantly agreed to hire when she could no longer stand without assistance. Huguette sat with her every afternoon during those months, occupying the same chair she had used during Anna's stroke in 1937, saying little, watching her mother's breathing grow shallower and more irregular. On the day Anna died, Huguette was not in the room. She had stepped out to the terrace for 15 minutes, and when she returned, the nurse told her it was over. Huguette looked at her mother's body, nodded, and left the room. She did not cry. The funeral was held at a Catholic church in Santa Barbara, attended by fewer than 20 people. Distant relatives Huguette had not seen in decades. A few of Anna's acquaintances from charitable organizations, household staff, and lawyers. Huguette wore black and sat in the front pew alone. She did not speak during the service. When it ended, she declined the reception that had been arranged at a nearby hotel, returned to Bellosguardo, and went to her room. The estate manager, a man named John Douglas who had worked for the family since the 1940s, asked if she needed anything. She said no. Anna's will left everything to Huguette: money, property, jewelry, the remainder of W.A.'s art collection that had been in Anna's possession. The inheritance was substantial, adding roughly $10 million to the fortune Huguette already controlled. The lawyer sent documents to Bellosguardo for her signature. She signed them and asked no questions. Douglas asked if she wanted to make any changes to the household staff or the property maintenance schedule. She said everything should continue exactly as it had been. For the first time in her life, Huguette was alone. She was 57 years old. She had never lived by herself, never managed a household independently, never made decisions without her mother's implicit approval, shaping the boundaries of what was acceptable. Anna had been a presence so constant that her absence created a void Huguette did not know how to fill. For weeks after the funeral, Huguette would walk to the morning room for breakfast and find herself startled that Anna was not sitting in her usual chair. She would set 2 places at the table before remembering. She would begin to speak, then stop when she realized there was no one to address. The staff watched her carefully during this period, uncertain how to behave. Anna had maintained strict boundaries between family and employees. Meals were served but not shared. Conversation was functional but not personal, and the staff were expected to remain invisible unless specifically needed. Huguette did not change these rules, but her enforcement of them became inconsistent. She would sometimes sit at the breakfast table for an hour after finishing her meal, staring at the empty chair across from her. The cook would enter to clear the dishes and find Huguette still sitting there, unmoving. When asked if she needed anything, Huguette would say no, then continue sitting. She stopped painting. The easel remained set up on the terrace, but she did not touch it. She stopped playing the harp. The instrument sat in the music room, gathering dust. She stopped walking through the gardens. For months, she remained inside the house, moving between her bedroom, the morning room, and occasionally the library, a room she had rarely entered while Anna was alive, but which now offered something she could not articulate. She would sit in one of the leather chairs W.A. had purchased in 1923, surrounded by books no one had read, and remain there for hours. The dolls became her primary focus. She spent entire days in her bedroom, rearranging them, changing their clothing, creating elaborate scenes that she would photograph with a camera she had purchased through a mail-order catalog. The photographs were technically competent but emotionally flat. Dolls posed at miniature tea parties, dolls arranged in ballroom configurations, dolls standing in gardens she had constructed from fabric and cardboard. She developed the photographs herself using chemicals and equipment delivered to Bellosguardo and kept them in albums she labeled by date and theme. No one else saw the photographs. She did not show them to the staff. She simply made them, filed them, and made more. She began writing letters to the doll manufacturers in France, asking about specific models, requesting information on production dates, inquiring whether certain dolls were still available for purchase. The letters were meticulous, typed on a typewriter she kept in her room, formatted with perfect business etiquette. The manufacturers responded, treating her as a valued customer, and she continued the correspondence for years. Some letters discussed technical details, the quality of bisque used in a particular doll's face, the origin of a wig, the authenticity of a costume. Others were stranger, asking whether the manufacturer knew anything about the history of specific dolls, as though the objects had biographies that existed independent of their creation. Douglas, the estate manager, began noticing problems with the property that Huguette was unwilling to address. The roof of the main house needed repairs. One of the guest cottages had developed foundation issues. The gardens required decisions about which plants to replace and which areas to redesign. He brought these issues to Huguette repeatedly, and she would tell him to handle it as he thought best. When he pressed her for specific approvals, especially for expenditures that required her signature, she would sign without reading the documents. Douglas was honest and managed the property competently, but Huguette's disengagement was creating a situation where she was legally and financially responsible. For a large estate, she had stopped inhabiting in any meaningful sense. She stopped going outside entirely in 1965. Douglas noticed because he had been tracking her daily routines as part of his responsibility for household security. For years, she had walked through the gardens at least once a week, always at the same time, always alone. Then she simply stopped. He asked if she was feeling ill. She said she was fine. He asked if something about the gardens displeased her. She said they were beautiful. He did not pursue the question, but he understood that something had shifted. Huguette had withdrawn not just from society, but from the physical world itself. The mail increased. Packages arrived weekly. Doll clothing from Paris, art supplies she no longer used, books she ordered from catalogs, music boxes, miniature furniture for the doll scenes she constructed. The deliveries were handled by staff who brought them to her room and left them outside the door. Huguette would retrieve them hours later, unpack them in private, and add the contents to the increasingly dense collection of objects that filled her bedroom. The room had begun to resemble a storage facility more than a living space. Shelves lined every wall, surfaces were covered with dolls and their accessories, and the bed was often the only clear area. She ate less. The cook prepared 3 meals a day, but Huguette often ate only a few bites of each. She lost weight gradually, not from illness, but from disinterest. Food was fuel, something necessary but unimportant, and she consumed only what was required to continue functioning. The staff grew concerned, but when Douglas suggested she see a doctor, she refused. She said she was perfectly healthy and did not need medical attention. The telephone in the house rang occasionally. Lawyers calling about estate matters, accountants with questions about taxes, distant relatives checking in out of obligation. Huguette stopped answering. She instructed the staff to take messages, and she would respond by letter weeks later, or not at all. The world outside Bellosguardo continued to attempt contact, and she methodically severed each connection. By 1967, she was speaking only to household staff, and those conversations were limited to brief instructions about meals, maintenance, or deliveries. She was 61 years old and had eliminated nearly every form of human interaction from her life. She lived in a mansion maintained by people she barely acknowledged, surrounded by possessions she did not use, in a routine that had calcified into something mechanical. Anna's death had not freed her. It had simply removed the last person whose presence imposed any structure on the formlessness Huguette had been cultivating since childhood. Huguette had maintained the Fifth Avenue mansion after Anna's death, paying the staff to keep it cleaned and climate-controlled despite never visiting. By 1968, the property taxes alone cost over $50,000 per year, and the building required constant maintenance to prevent deterioration. Her accountants suggested she sell it. The Manhattan real estate market was strong, and the mansion, 121 rooms on a full city block, would command an enormous price. Huguette refused. She said her father had built it, and it should remain in the family. The accountants did not argue. They simply added the expenses to the monthly reports she never read. In 1970, the building next to the mansion was sold to developers who planned to demolish it and construct a modern apartment tower. The construction would take 3 years and generate noise, dust, and disruption that would make the mansion uninhabitable, even if anyone had been living there. Huguette's lawyers contacted her, suggesting this might be an appropriate time to reconsider selling. She told them to find her an apartment instead. She wanted something in the same neighborhood, with views of Central Park, private and quiet. She did not say she intended to live there. She said only that she needed it. The lawyers found an apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue, at the corner of 72nd Street, directly across from the park. The building was exclusive, with only a few units per floor and a co-op board that carefully screened potential residents. Huguette purchased a 2-bedroom apartment on the 8th floor for $125,000. The lawyers assumed this would be her new residence. They were partially correct. She moved nothing into the apartment. No furniture, no artwork, no personal belongings. She instructed the lawyers to keep it empty. Then, 2 months later, she purchased the apartment directly next to it. another two-bedroom unit for $130,000. Again, she moved nothing in. The lawyers asked for clarification on her intentions. She said she needed privacy and did not want neighbors. They suggested she could have purchased a larger single unit. She said she preferred separate apartments. Over the next 3 years, Huguette purchased 2 more apartments in the building, one directly below her original unit, one adjacent to that. The total cost was over $600,000, and the result was a cluster of 4 empty apartments, locked and maintained, but never occupied. The building staff cleaned them monthly. The utilities remained active. The co-op fees were paid on time, but no one lived there. Huguette finally moved to New York in 1973, not into any of the apartments at 907 Fifth Avenue, but into the mansion, which had been empty for 10 years. She stayed for 6 weeks, occupying only 2 rooms, a bedroom and a sitting room on the second floor, while contractors worked on repairs the building required to remain structurally sound. She saw no one during this period except household staff. She did not go outside. She did not visit the apartments she owned a few blocks away. When the repairs were completed, she returned to Bellosguardo without explanation. The apartments remained empty. In 1977, she purchased 3 more units in the same building, 2 on the 8th floor, 1 on the 9th, bringing her total to 7. The co-op board, which had initially been pleased to have such a wealthy and unobtrusive resident, began asking questions. Board members wanted to know why she was accumulating apartments without living in any of them. Her lawyers provided vague explanations about privacy and future plans. The board accepted this, but other residents grew curious. A few attempted to contact Huguette through the building management, expressing interest in purchasing one of her units if she ever decided to sell. She did not respond. By 1980, Huguette owned 9 apartments at 907 Fifth Avenue. The total purchase price had exceeded $2 million. The annual maintenance fees alone were over $100,000. She had never spent a single night in any of them. The apartments existed as a buffer, a zone of emptiness she controlled, preventing anyone else from occupying the space around where she might, theoretically, someday choose to live. The building staff found the situation increasingly strange. They had keys to all 9 units and were required to inspect them regularly. They reported that the apartments were completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, nothing personal. Some had curtains installed, others did not. A few had working telephones that never rang. One apartment had a single chair in the living room, placed in front of a window overlooking the park. No one knew who had put it there or why. Huguette began purchasing furniture in 1983, but not for the apartments. She bought it through catalogs and auctions, had it delivered to 907 Fifth Avenue, and instructed the building staff to place it in storage rooms in the basement. The furniture was expensive: Chippendale chairs, Victorian sofas, French antique tables, and it accumulated in the storage areas, still wrapped in protective coverings, never unpacked. When the storage rooms filled, she rented additional space in a commercial facility in Queens. The furniture continued arriving, continued being stored, and was never used. Her lawyers suggested repeatedly that the situation was financially wasteful. The apartments were appreciating in value, but the carrying costs were substantial, and the unused furniture was simply depreciating in storage. Huguette responded that she might need the apartments eventually and preferred to have them available. When asked when she planned to move to New York, she said she had not decided. The lawyers stopped asking. In 1985, the mansion at 962 Fifth Avenue was finally sold. Huguette had resisted for years, but the property taxes had become untenable, over $500,000 annually, and the building required millions in renovations to meet updated safety codes. The sale price was $11 million, far below what the property would have brought if it had been maintained properly, but Huguette accepted the offer without negotiation. The buyers were developers who planned to demolish the mansion and build a modern apartment tower. Huguette was informed of this. She signed the papers anyway. The mansion was emptied over 6 months. The contents, furniture, artwork, WA's remaining library, decades of accumulated household items were cataloged by auction houses and estate specialists. Most of it was sold. Some pieces went to museums. A few items, primarily things that had belonged to Anna, were shipped to Bellosguardo or placed in storage with the furniture at 907 Fifth Avenue. Huguette did not attend the sale. She did not request any specific items be preserved. When asked if she wanted to visit the mansion one final time before demolition, she said no. The building was demolished in 1986. Newspaper articles about the destruction mentioned W.A. Clark's legacy and the end of an era of Gilded Age excess. A few mentioned that his daughter still lived in California. None mentioned the 9 empty apartments she owned a few blocks away, or the furniture-filling storage room she never visited, or the fact that she had spent more than $3 million creating a residential fortress she had no intention of inhabiting. By 1987, she had purchased 3 more apartments at 907 Fifth Avenue, bringing her total to 12. She now controlled more than 15,000 square feet of space in one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings. She occupied none of it. The apartments remained empty, cleaned monthly by staff who moved through them like ghosts tending to a museum that had no exhibits. Huguette stayed at Bellosguardo 3,000 miles away, surrounded by dolls and unopened packages, in a house she also barely used, paying millions to maintain spaces she had long since stopped occupying in any meaningful sense. In 1988, Huguette contacted a doll restoration specialist in New York named Helen Bixby. Bixby ran a small business repairing antique dolls, replacing damaged bisque, restringing limbs, restoring wigs, repainting faces. She received a letter from Huguette asking if she would accept a long-term commission. The letter was typed, formal, and oddly specific. Huguette explained that she owned a collection of French dolls requiring ongoing care and maintenance. She wanted Bixby to examine each doll, document its condition, and perform whatever repairs were necessary. She would pay whatever Bixby's standard rates were, plus expenses. The letter did not mention how many dolls were in the collection. Bixby agreed and traveled to Bellosguardo in March 1988. She was met at the gate by estate staff who escorted her to a room on the second floor that had been converted into what Huguette called her doll hospital. The room contained over 300 dolls, arranged on shelves that lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Most were French bisque dolls from the late 1800s and early 1900s, Jumeaux, Bruce, Steiners, each wearing elaborate period costumes. Some were displayed standing on small wooden platforms. Others sat in miniature furniture. A few lay in small beds, as though they were actually patients requiring care. Huguette did not meet Bixby in person. She sent instructions through the estate manager, Douglas, explaining that Bixby should examine each doll and prepare a written assessment. Any doll requiring repair should be carefully packed and shipped to Bixby's studio in New York, where the work would be completed and the doll returned. Huguette would pay all shipping costs and would cover repairs without price limits. She wanted each doll restored to perfect condition. Bixby spent 3 days examining the collection. She later told a colleague that the dolls were extraordinarily valuable. Some were rare models that would sell at auction for tens of thousands of dollars, but they had been handled so frequently that many showed wear. Wigs needed replacement. Paint on faces had faded or chipped. Elastic cording holding limbs in place had deteriorated. Costumes, though expensive, had been changed so many times that the fabric showed stress at seams and fasteners. It was clear that someone had been playing with these dolls regularly, treating them not as collectibles, but as companions. She prepared a detailed report listing 60 dolls that required immediate repair and another 100 that would need attention within the next few years. The report was delivered to Douglas, who passed it to Huguette. 2 weeks later, Bixby received a check for $15,000 as a retainer and instructions to begin work. The first shipment of dolls arrived at her studio in April. 20 dolls, each wrapped in tissue paper and packed in individual wooden crates. The repairs took months. Bixby replaced wigs using human hair that had to be sourced from specialty suppliers in Europe. She repainted faces using techniques developed in the 1800s, mixing pigments to match original colors. She restrung bodies with new elastic, calibrated to hold limbs in place without being so tight that the bisque might crack. Each doll required between 20 and 40 hours of work. When finished, she photographed the doll from multiple angles, documenting the repairs, and shipped it back to Bellosguardo with a written report detailing what had been done. Huguette responded to each report with a thank you letter. The letters were warm, more personal than her initial business correspondence had been. She praised Bixby's craftsmanship, asked technical questions about specific repair techniques, and occasionally included anecdotes about individual dolls. where she had acquired them, what she liked about their faces, what clothing she had commissioned for them. The letters revealed something Huguette had not shown in decades of interaction with lawyers, accountants, and estate staff: genuine emotion. She wrote that one doll, a jumeau with blue glass eyes, reminded her of her sister Andre. She did not elaborate on why, but the sentence appeared in the middle of a letter discussing wig repair, incongruous and unexplained. She wrote that another doll, a Bru with a bisque body, had been a gift from her mother in 1930, shortly after her divorce. She said she had kept it in her bedroom ever since. She wrote that a third doll, a Steiner with a mechanical walking mechanism, had been damaged when she dropped it in 1952, and she was glad Bixby had been able to repair the internal gears because the doll had not walked in 36 years. The correspondence continued for 3 years. Bixby completed repairs on over 80 dolls, returned them all to Bellosguardo, and was paid over $200,000 for her work. She never met Huguette in person. When she asked Douglas if she might speak with Huguette directly to clarify some technical questions, she was told that Mrs. Clark preferred written communication. Bixby accepted this and continued the work through letters. In 1991, Huguette began commissioning new dolls. She contacted doll artists in France, Germany, and the United States, sending them detailed specifications for custom creations. She wanted dolls modeled after specific historical figures: Marie Antoinette, Empress Eugénie, various French aristocrats, dressed in accurate period costumes. She sent reference materials, books, photographs, fabric samples, and asked the artists to replicate the clothing exactly. The commissions were expensive, often costing $10,000 or more per doll, and she ordered dozens of them. The new dolls arrived at Bellosguardo throughout the early 1990s, each accompanied by documentation from the artist explaining the historical research behind the costume and construction. Huguette read these documents carefully, filed them in binders organized by doll, and wrote thank you letters to the artists that were sometimes longer than the original commission requests. She asked follow-up questions about historical details: whether a particular style of shoe was accurate for 1780, whether a specific shade of silk would have been available in 1860, whether the undergarments were constructed correctly. The artists, accustomed to collectors who simply wanted beautiful objects, found themselves engaged in lengthy historical discussions with a woman who seemed more interested in authenticity than aesthetics. The doll hospital expanded. Huguette converted a second room on the second floor into additional storage, then a third room into a workshop where she kept supplies for maintaining and dressing the dolls herself. She purchased sewing machines, fabric, thread, miniature shoes, wigs, and repair materials. She spent hours each day in these rooms, moving between dolls, changing their clothing, adjusting their positions, photographing them in different configurations. The staff heard her talking sometimes, though they could not make out the words. When Douglas asked if she needed assistance with anything, she said she was perfectly content. She commissioned a miniature chateau to house some of the dolls. The structure was built by a craftsman in Connecticut based on drawings Huguette provided. It was 6 feet tall, contained 12 rooms, and cost $60,000 to construct. When it arrived at Bellosguardo, Huguette spent weeks furnishing it with miniature furniture, chandeliers, paintings, and carpets. She populated it with specific dolls, creating a permanent installation that she photographed extensively. The chateau remained set up in one of the doll rooms, its inhabitants frozen in whatever scene Huguette had arranged, never altered again. By 1995, the collection had grown to over 500 dolls. The 3 rooms could barely contain them. Shelves had been installed wherever wall space allowed. Dolls sat on windowsills, on tables and chairs. Some were displayed in glass cases Huguette had purchased from museum supply companies. The rooms had taken on the atmosphere of an institution, organized, cataloged, maintained with institutional precision, but an institution with no visitors, no purpose beyond Huguette's private obsession, and no future except continued accumulation. She was 89 years old, living alone in a mansion she barely inhabited, spending her days caring for objects that represented people who had never existed. The dolls had become her primary relationship, requiring more attention and emotional investment than any human being had received from her in decades. She wrote about them, photographed them, repaired them, dressed them, and spoke to them. They did not respond, which was exactly what she needed. In 1996, Huguette instructed her estate manager Douglas to stop scheduling any in-person meetings. She had not seen visitors for several years, but there had still been occasional exceptions. Accountants who insisted on presenting documents in person, lawyers handling estate matters who said certain signatures required face-to-face verification, a few distant relatives who attempted visits out of obligation or curiosity. Douglas had managed these encounters, arranging brief meetings in the library where Huguette would appear, say little, sign what needed signing, and leave. Now she wanted them stopped completely. All business would be conducted by mail or telephone. No exceptions. Douglas asked what should be done if someone arrived unannounced. She told him to turn them away at the gate. He asked what if it was a family member. She said especially if it was a family member. He asked what if there was an emergency requiring immediate decisions. She said emergencies could be handled by phone. He did not argue. He updated the security protocols and informed the staff that Mrs. Clark was not receiving visitors under any circumstances. The telephone became her sole connection to the world outside Bellosguardo, but she used it rarely and on her own terms. She would call her accountant, a man named Irving Kamsler, who had managed her finances since the 1970s, perhaps once a month. The conversations were brief. She would ask if there were any urgent matters requiring her attention. He would summarize whatever needed summarizing, and she would thank him and end the call. She never asked how he was, never engaged in conversation beyond the immediate business, never allowed the professional relationship to become anything approaching personal. She called her attorney, Wallace Bach, even less frequently. Bach had taken over managing her legal affairs in the 1980s, handling property matters, tax issues, and the endless administrative work required to maintain her various holdings. He tried periodically to visit Bellosguardo to discuss matters he felt required more than a phone conversation. She refused every request. When he pressed, saying certain legal documents really did need to be reviewed in person, she told him to mail them. He would mail them, she would sign them without reading them carefully, and mail them back. This continued for years. The relatives stopped trying to visit. Huguette had dozens of cousins, nieces, and nephews from her father's side, descendants of W.A.'s children from his first marriage, but she had not maintained relationships with any of them. A few had attempted contact over the years, sending Christmas cards or letters updating her on family events. She did not respond. By the late 1990s, most of the family assumed she was either dead or had made clear she wanted nothing to do with them. Both assumptions were partially correct. One relative, a grandniece named Carla Hall, made a final attempt at contact in 1997. Hall had heard family stories about Huguette, about the mansion and the fortune, and the eccentric recluse who owned apartments she never used. Hall wrote a letter saying she would be in California and would like to visit, not for money or favors, but simply to meet the aunt she had heard about, but never known. The letter was polite, casual, expressing no expectations. Huguette received it, read it, and did not respond. Hall never wrote again. The staff at Bellosguardo, the only people who saw Huguette regularly, noticed she was changing. She had always been reserved, but now she was becoming nearly invisible even within her own house. She stopped coming to the morning room for meals. Food was delivered on trays to her bedroom or to the doll rooms, and the trays would be returned hours later, mostly untouched. She stopped walking through any part of the house except the second floor. The library, the music room, the formal rooms on the first floor, spaces she had occasionally passed through, were now avoided entirely. She confined herself to a shrinking territory. Bedroom, bathroom, doll rooms, nothing else. She stopped allowing the housekeeping staff into her private rooms. They could clean the hallways, the bathrooms outside her suite, the unused rooms throughout the house, but not her bedroom and not the doll rooms. Those spaces were off limits. Douglas, concerned about basic sanitation and safety, tried to negotiate some arrangement where staff could at least remove trash and change linens. Huguette agreed to leave trash outside her door and to allow fresh linens to be delivered once a week. She would handle changing the bed herself. Douglas accepted this compromise because he had no alternative. The doll rooms became increasingly chaotic. Without regular cleaning, dust accumulated. The sheer number of dolls, over 500 now, created clutter that Huguette could no longer manage. Boxes of doll clothing filled corners. Supplies for doll maintenance covered every flat surface. Photographs she had taken were stacked in piles because she had run out of album space. The rooms had crossed the line from organized collection to hoarding, but no one could enter to help. and Huguette showed no awareness that anything was wrong. She stopped talking to the staff except through notes. She would write instructions on paper and leave them outside her door. Requests for specific meals, orders for supplies to be purchased, questions about household maintenance. The notes were polite but impersonal, signed only HMC for Huguette Marcel Clark. The staff would respond with notes of their own, creating a paper trail of communication between people living in the same house who never spoke face to face. In 1998, Douglas retired. He had managed Bellosguardo for over 30 years, longer than Huguette had known anyone besides her mother. She sent him a note thanking him for his service and a check for $100,000 as a retirement gift. He wrote back asking if he could visit one final time to say goodbye properly. She did not respond. He left without seeing her, and the estate transitioned to a new manager, a man named Chris Sattler, who had worked in property management for wealthy families. Sattler's first meeting with his employer was a phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes. The last photograph anyone took of Huguette was in 1930, shortly after her divorce from Gower. She was 24 years old in the picture, standing in a garden, wearing a light-colored dress, looking away from the camera. The photograph appeared in a magazine article about wealthy American heiresses, published without her permission. She saw it months later and was furious, though she never explained to anyone why. From that point forward, she refused to be photographed under any circumstances. By 1998, she had succeeded in erasing her visual presence from the world. No one alive, except the Bellosguardo staff, who were bound by employment agreements not to discuss her, knew what she looked like. She was 92 years old and had achieved complete invisibility. She spent her days with the dolls, her nights with the dolls, and her entire existence in rooms where human connection had been systematically eliminated. The telephone on her bedside table rang occasionally. Kamsler calling about financial matters, Bach calling about legal issues, medical suppliers confirming orders for equipment she was beginning to need as her health declined. She answered some calls, ignored others. When she did answer, her voice was faint, hesitant, as though speaking required effort she could barely summon. The estate around her continued functioning. Gardens were maintained, buildings were repaired, staff performed their duties, bills were paid. The machinery of wealth operated smoothly, requiring almost nothing from Huguette except her continued existence. She had constructed a life where she was technically alive but functionally absent, present in the legal sense but disappeared in every other way. The world moved forward. She stayed exactly where she was, surrounded by hundreds of dolls with glass eyes that saw nothing and painted smiles that meant nothing. By the turn of the millennium, Huguette had not seen another human face, excluding the occasional unavoidable glimpse of household staff, in over 5 years. She had not left Bellosguardo in a decade. She had not left the second floor of the house in 3 years. The shrinking continued, concentric circles of withdrawal that were pulling tighter with each passing month, compressing her existence into smaller and smaller spaces until there would be nothing left but a locked room and the silence inside it. The first hospitalization occurred in April 1991. Huguette had developed what her primary physician, Dr. Jules Pierre, described as a mild respiratory infection. Nothing serious, treatable with antibiotics, no reason for alarm. She was 84 years old, and Pierre had been making house calls to Bellosguardo for 3 years, ever since the previous doctor retired. He examined her in her bedroom, surrounded by dolls that watched from every surface, and suggested she might recover more quickly at a hospital, where she could receive intravenous antibiotics and monitoring. Huguette refused. He explained that her age made even minor infections potentially dangerous. She said she would not leave Bellosguardo. Pierre made daily visits for a week, administering antibiotics and checking her vitals. The infection cleared. But during that week, something shifted in Huguette's perception of what constituted safety. She had always viewed Bellosguardo as protection from the world outside, but now she began to see it as potentially insufficient. The infection had originated from within the house, in the dust that accumulated in her closed-off rooms, in the air that circulated through a ventilation system that needed updating, in her own body that was aging despite the isolation she had constructed around it. The fortress had a weakness she had not accounted for: her own mortality. In August 1991, she contacted Pierre and told him she wanted to be admitted to a hospital in New York. Not because she was sick, but because she might become sick, and she wanted to be somewhere with immediate access to medical care when that happened. Pierre asked which hospital she preferred. She said she did not know any hospitals in New York. He suggested several: Mount Sinai, New York Presbyterian, Lenox Hill, all excellent facilities. She asked which was quietest. He said that was not typically how hospitals were evaluated. She said she needed somewhere that would allow her privacy. He suggested Beth Israel Medical Center on the Upper East Side, which had private rooms and a reputation for accommodating patients with specific needs. She was admitted to Beth Israel on September 12, 1991, listed as a patient requiring observation for potential cardiac issues, a diagnosis vague enough to justify extended stays without requiring proof of acute illness. She was assigned to room 3K, a private room on the third floor with a window overlooking the building's interior courtyard. The room was standard hospital size, approximately 200 square feet, containing a bed, a chair, a small table, and a private bathroom. There was no medical equipment initially because she required no medical treatment. She checked in as a precaution, intending to stay a few weeks. She stayed 20 years. The hospital staff were confused from the beginning. Huguette presented no symptoms requiring hospitalization. Her vital signs were normal. She could walk, feed herself, manage all basic activities without assistance. When nurses asked if she felt ill, she said she felt fine. When they asked if she wanted to go home, she said she was already home. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Newman, examined her repeatedly and found nothing wrong. He recommended discharge. She refused. He explained that hospitals were for sick people. She asked if there was a rule requiring her to leave. He admitted there was not, as long as she could pay. She said that would not be a problem. Her attorney, Wallace Bach, negotiated an arrangement with hospital administration. Huguette would pay approximately $400,000 per year for the private room, plus additional fees for nursing care and services. In exchange, Beth Israel would allow her to occupy room 3K indefinitely. The contract was irregular but legally permissible. She had purchased a permanent residence inside a medical facility. She began transforming the room immediately. Standard hospital furniture was removed except the bed. She had a wooden desk delivered from one of her Fifth Avenue apartments, along with a comfortable chair, lamps, and dozens of boxes containing dolls, art supplies, and books from Bello Sguardo. Shelves were installed along the walls, dolls arranged in careful groupings, painting supplies organized on the desk. The room became a compressed version of what she had left behind. The nursing staff adapted with varying levels of discomfort. Some found Huguette pleasant, polite, never demanding. Others found her presence unsettling, occupying a room that should have housed someone who actually needed care while she sat among her dolls, painting pictures she stacked against the walls. She was not on a medication schedule. She had no treatment plan. She simply existed in the space, paying vast sums for the privilege of remaining in a building designed for people who wanted to leave. She hired private nurses to attend to her around the clock, not because she needed medical care, but because she wanted human presence without human interaction. The nurses worked 8-hour shifts, sitting in corners, reading or watching muted television, available if needed, but expected not to initiate conversation. One nurse, Hadassah Perry, became her primary attendant in 1992. Perry was a Filipino immigrant who had been recommended as reliable, discreet, and willing to treat Huguette's hospital residents as if it were perfectly normal. She sat quiet and still for hours. She brought meals, organized the growing doll collection, mailed packages to doll artists in France. She spoke only when spoken to. Huguette liked her in the way someone likes a functional appliance. She performed her role competently and demanded nothing in return. The hospital room developed the same atmosphere Bello Sguardo had possessed, a contained space where time moved differently, where the outside world penetrated only through deliveries and phone calls. The routines were identical. She painted. She rearranged dolls. She ordered supplies through catalogs. The only difference was the location and the presence of medical equipment in the hallway outside. Equipment she never needed but found comforting anyway. Her attorneys and accountants continued managing her affairs remotely, calling occasionally to discuss property taxes, maintenance issues. Decisions required for the apartments she still owned and never occupied. When Bach suggested visiting in person to discuss estate planning, she said that was not necessary. She had not seen him in 15 years and did not see why that needed to change. The staff at Beth Israel gradually stopped questioning her presence. She became part of the institution's permanent landscape. The woman in 3K who never left, who paid extraordinary amounts to occupy a room she did not medically require. New employees, told about the arrangement during orientation, assumed it was a joke until they walked past and saw her sitting at the desk, painting another watercolor of a French village she had never visited. By 1995, she had been in room 3K for 4 years. The hospital bed had never been used for sleeping. She piled books and art supplies on it, using it as a surface. She slept in the chair or on a cot the nurses brought when she asked. When administrators suggested she might be more comfortable in one of the 12 apartments she owned blocks away, she said the hospital room was exactly the right size. She was paying them $500,000 a year. That was explanation enough. Hadassah Perry worked 12-hour shifts by 1997, sometimes 16 when Huguette requested it. The hospital had rules about nurse-patient ratios and maximum hours, but those rules applied to staff nurses, not private contractors paid directly by patients. Perry was paid $30 per hour initially, which became $50 by 1999, then $75 by 2001. The increases came without negotiation. Huguette would simply tell her accountant, Irving Kamsler, that Perry's rate was changing, and Kamsler would adjust the payments accordingly. Perry never asked for raises. They appeared as rewards for continued presence, for maintained silence, for the performance of a role that required sitting still while an elderly woman arranged dolls in a hospital room. The relationship between them was not friendship. Huguette did not want friends. She wanted reliable service providers who understood that their job was to facilitate her isolation, not penetrate it. Perry understood this perfectly. She arrived on time, left when dismissed, spoke only when addressed, and treated the bizarre circumstances of her employment as if they were completely ordinary. When other nurses asked her what Huguette was like, Perry said she was a nice lady who liked privacy. When they pressed for details, Perry said there were no details to share. But something shifted in 1998. Huguette began giving Perry gifts, small things at first, a box of chocolates, a scarf, a book about French dolls. Perry accepted them politely, thanked her, and said nothing more. Then the gifts became larger, a check for $5,000 as a Christmas bonus, another $10,000 6 months later, described as appreciation for excellent service, then $25,000, then $50,000. Perry deposited the checks without comment. Huguette never explained why she was giving them, and Perry never asked. By 2000, the gifts had become substantial enough that Kamsler noticed. He was reviewing Huguette's monthly expenditures and saw payments to Perry that went far beyond nursing wages. $100,000 in March, $150,000 in July, $200,000 in November. He called Huguette and asked if these amounts were correct. She said yes. He asked what the payments were for. She said Perry took good care of her. He said that was an extraordinary amount for basic nursing care. She said Perry deserved it. He suggested they should document the payments more carefully for tax purposes. She said he should handle whatever documentation was necessary. Kamsler did not press further. He had managed Huguette's finances for 30 years and had learned that her spending decisions followed logic comprehensible only to her. She had paid millions to maintain empty apartments. She had paid hundreds of thousands for doll repairs. She had paid $500,000 annually to live in a hospital room. Compared to that, giving large cash gifts to her primary nurse seemed almost reasonable. The gifts continued escalating. In 2001, Huguette gave Perry $500,000. In 2002, another $600,000. The payments were documented as gifts subject to gift tax, processed through proper legal channels. There was nothing illegal about them. Wealthy people gave money to employees they valued, but the amounts were disproportionate to any service Perry was providing, and the frequency suggested something beyond simple generosity. Perry began purchasing property. She bought a house in Brooklyn for $400,000 in 2002. She bought another in Queens for $350,000 in 2003. She bought a third property in 2004. Her salary as a nurse was roughly $150,000 per year. Excellent money, but not enough to accumulate a real estate portfolio. The difference came from Huguette in gifts that now totaled over $2 million. Other nurses noticed. They saw Perry arriving in expensive cars, wearing jewelry that seemed inconsistent with nursing wages, taking vacations to Europe that she mentioned casually during shift changes. Some were jealous, others were suspicious. A few reported their concerns to hospital administration, suggesting that Perry might be exploiting an elderly patient who was not mentally competent to make financial decisions. The hospital investigated, interviewing Huguette directly. She was lucid, articulate, and clear about her intentions. She told the investigators that Perry was an excellent nurse who made her comfortable, and she chose to express her appreciation through financial gifts. When asked if Perry had requested the money, she said no. When asked if she understood how much she was giving, she said yes. When asked if she was being pressured or manipulated, she said absolutely not. The investigation concluded that while the arrangement was unusual, there was no evidence of exploitation or undue influence. Huguette was legally competent and free to distribute her money as she wished. The gifts continued. By 2005, Perry had received over $5 million. By 2007, over $10 million. The relationship had transformed into something neither of them explicitly acknowledged. Huguette was purchasing loyalty, purchasing presence, purchasing the illusion of human connection without its demands. Perry was accepting payment for playing a role that required her to treat extraordinary wealth transfers as if they were minor courtesies. Bach, Huguette's attorney, grew concerned. He had worked with wealthy clients for decades and had seen situations where employees leveraged their positions to extract money from isolated elderly people. He visited Beth Israel in 2008, his first in-person meeting with Huguette in over 20 years, to discuss the Perry situation directly. She agreed to see him, which surprised him. He arrived at room 3K and found it exactly as he had imagined. Small, cluttered with dolls, dominated by the presence of an elderly woman who looked far older than her 102 years. He asked about the gifts to Perry. Huguette said Perry was devoted to her care. He asked if she understood that she had given Perry more than $10 million. She said she was aware. He asked if Perry had requested this money. She said no. The gifts were entirely her idea. He suggested that the amounts might create legal problems after her death, that relatives might challenge them as evidence of undue influence. She said she had no relatives who mattered. He said that was not technically true. She had distant family from her father's first marriage. She said she had not spoken to them in 70 years and did not care what they thought. Bach tried a different approach. He suggested that if she wanted to compensate Perry generously, they could structure it through her estate, creating a bequest that would be clearly documented as intentional rather than appearing as a series of escalating gifts that might look suspicious. Huguette said she preferred to give the money now while she was alive to see Perry benefit from it. Bach asked why it was so important to give such large amounts to someone who was, ultimately, an employee. Huguette looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Perry stayed. That was all. Perry stayed." Bach left without pushing further. He understood as much as anyone could what Huguette meant. Perry remained present in a situation that was absurd, uncomfortable, and increasingly strange as Huguette aged. The gifts were payment not for medical care, but for continued tolerance of circumstances that would drive most people away. Huguette was buying the one thing her wealth could not naturally provide: someone willing to witness her disappearance. Bellosguardo sat empty. The estate had been unoccupied since 1991, when Huguette left for Beth Israel, but the property continued functioning as if she might return at any moment. The staff maintained their schedules. Gardeners arrived at 7 each morning, trimming hedges that no one would walk past, pruning roses that no one would see. Housekeepers cleaned rooms that accumulated no dirt except what filtered through sealed windows. The cook prepared no meals, but the kitchen remained stocked with fresh supplies that were replaced weekly and thrown away unused. The cost was approximately $400,000 per year. Property taxes, staff salaries, utilities, maintenance, landscaping, insurance, all paid from Huguette's accounts without question or adjustment. Kamsler processed the payments monthly, noting them in reports Huguette never read. When he suggested, in 2003, that perhaps the staffing could be reduced given that no one lived there, she said the house should be maintained exactly as it had been. He asked if she planned to return. She said she had not decided. He did not ask again. The main house developed problems that money could delay, but not prevent. The roof needed replacement in 2001. The cost was $800,000. Expensive even by California standards, but the house was large and the materials had to match the original 1933 construction. The foundation showed cracks in 2004, requiring repairs that cost another $600,000. The plumbing system, installed when the house was built, began failing in 2006. Replacing it meant tearing up floors, breaking through walls, modernizing 70-year-old infrastructure. The estimate was $1.2 million. Huguette approved it without asking for details. The gardens required constant work to maintain the precise aesthetic Huguette Clark had established. The terrace lawns needed weekly mowing. The rose beds needed pruning, fertilizing, pest control. The reflecting pools needed cleaning. The fountains needed repair. The palm trees needed trimming. The head gardener, a man named Marcus Gonzalez, who had worked at Belos Guardo since 1989, supervised a crew of 4 who spent 40 hours per week maintaining grounds that existed only for themselves. Gonzalez sometimes wondered what would happen if they simply stopped. How long before the gardens transformed into wild coastal scrub, before the lawns disappeared under native grasses, before the imported plants died and the land returned to what it had been before Clark's money imposed European order on California hillside. But they did not stop. Gonzalez was paid $85,000 per year, excellent money for gardening work, and his crew earned wages well above market rate. They understood implicitly that their job was not horticulture, but preservation. They were maintaining a museum with no visitors, a monument to wealth that required wealth to sustain its own existence. The house began showing signs of neglect that maintenance could not address. Rooms that were cleaned but never used developed a particular staleness. Paint faded despite the drawn curtains. Furniture deteriorated from lack of human contact more than from use. Fabrics grew brittle, wood warped. The house was dying from abandonment disguised as care. Other properties required similar maintenance. The 12 apartments at 907 Fifth Avenue remained empty, cleaned monthly by building staff, their utilities active, their systems maintained. The co-op fees alone totaled $180,000 per year. Several apartments needed renovation, kitchens with appliances from the 1970s, bathrooms with fixtures that had calcified from minimal use, floors that showed wear patterns from cleaning crews rather than residents. Huguette approved renovations whenever the building management suggested them, spending $200,000 to update a kitchen in an apartment she had never entered, $150,000 to modernize bathrooms she would never use. The building's co-op board grew frustrated. They had tolerated Huguette's unusual arrangement for decades, but by 2005, the situation had become untenable. 12 units in a 40-unit building were permanently empty, maintained but unoccupied, representing dead space in one of Manhattan's most expensive buildings. Other residents complained. Potential buyers asked why so many apartments appeared vacant. The board contacted Bach, requesting that Huguette either occupy the apartments, rent them, or sell them. Bach relayed the message. Huguette said no to all 3 options. She wanted the apartments maintained as they were. The board pressed harder, suggesting that her continued occupancy of empty units violated the spirit of cooperative housing. Bach responded that she was meeting all financial obligations and breaking no rules. The board considered forcing a sale but concluded that the legal battle would be expensive and probably unsuccessful. They accepted the situation with resentment that spread through the building like dampness through walls. The furniture stored in the building's basement and in the Queens facility continued accumulating. Huguette bought a Louis XVI settee for $45,000 in 2002. It was delivered to the Fifth Avenue building, carried down to storage, and never unpacked. She bought a Chippendale dining table with 12 chairs for $85,000 in 2004. Same process: delivery, storage, abandonment. She bought paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, all expensive, all consigned immediately to climate-controlled storage, where they remained wrapped in protective materials, gradually appreciating in value as investments she would never see. Kamsler tracked it all: every property tax payment, every maintenance bill, every storage fee, every renovation cost, every piece of furniture purchased and abandoned. His monthly reports ran to dozens of pages, documenting money flowing out in hundreds of small streams that together formed a river. In 2007, Huguette's total expenditures on property maintenance, storage, and related costs exceeded $2.5 million. She spent this money maintaining spaces she did not occupy, preserving things she did not use, sustaining a physical empire that existed only on paper and in the work of employees who kept it all running. Her wealth could sustain this indefinitely. The Clark fortune, carefully invested over decades, generated income faster than she spent it. Her net worth in 2008 was estimated at over $300 million. She could maintain empty houses, empty apartments, and storage facilities full of unused furniture for the rest of her life without financial strain. The money was self-perpetuating, requiring nothing from her except continued existence. But the properties themselves were changing. Bellosguardo's isolation, once chosen, had become enforced. The estate was worth over $100 million by 2008. The land alone, 23 acres with ocean views in Santa Barbara, would command an extraordinary price. But it could not be sold while Huguette lived, and she would not allow it to be used. It existed in a legal and practical limbo, too valuable to abandon, too bound to her intentions to be monetized, trapped in the same suspension that characterized her entire relationship with the material world. The apartments at 907 Fifth Avenue faced similar paralysis. They were worth over $50 million collectively by 2009, but they could not be sold, could not be rented, could not be occupied. They simply existed, cleaned and maintained and empty, waiting for decisions that would never come from a woman who had spent 20 years in a hospital room, surrounded by dolls, painting pictures of places she would never visit, paying millions to maintain properties she would never see again. Wallace Bach had been preparing Huguette's will since 1997. The document required unusual care. She owned properties in multiple states, held assets in various trusts established by her father decades earlier, and had no direct heirs. Her nearest relatives were descendants of W.A. Clark's children from his first marriage, people she had not seen or spoken to in over 70 years. She wanted none of them to inherit anything. The first draft of the will, completed in 2000, left the bulk of her estate to charity. The Corcoran Gallery in Washington would receive her art collection. Various medical research foundations would receive cash bequests. Bellosguardo would be donated to an arts organization that would convert it into a museum. The Fifth Avenue apartments would be sold, and the proceeds distributed to hospitals. It was a standard wealthy person's will, philanthropic, tax-efficient, designed to create legacy through institutional giving. Huguette signed it without reading it carefully. Bach asked if she wanted him to review the specific provisions. She said that was his job, not hers. He asked if she had any personal bequests she wanted to include. She said no. The will was filed with her other estate documents, and Bach assumed it was settled. Then she changed her mind. In 2002, she told Bach she wanted to revise the will. He asked what needed changing. She said she wanted to leave money to her nurse. He assumed she meant a modest bequest, $50,000, perhaps $100,000, a generous but appropriate thank you for years of service. She said she wanted to leave Hadassah Perry $5 million. Bach experienced enough not to react visibly, asked if she was certain about the amount. She said yes. He drafted an amendment, and she signed it. The revisions continued. In 2004, she increased Perry's bequest to $10 million. In 2005, to $15 million. Each time, Bach prepared the paperwork, noted his concerns in internal memos his law firm required for documentation, and processed the changes. The concerns were professional, not personal. Large bequests to caregivers invited legal challenges, especially when the benefactor was elderly, isolated, and had relatives who could claim undue influence. But Huguette insisted, and she remained legally competent. Bach could advise, but not refuse. By 2007, the will had been revised 8 times. Perry's bequest was now $20 million. The charitable donations had been reduced accordingly. The Corcoran would receive less art. The medical foundations would receive smaller amounts. Bach suggested creating a separate trust for Perry to provide the money in structured payments rather than a lump sum, which might offer some legal protection. Huguette said no. She wanted Perry to receive the money outright, immediately, with no restrictions. Kamsler, the accountant, became involved in the estate planning discussions in 2008. He had managed Huguette's finances for 40 years and had watched the Perry situation evolve from normal employment to something he could not categorize. The gifts Huguette had already given Perry totaled over $20 million. Adding another $20 million bequest meant Perry stood to receive $40 million total from a woman she had met as a paid caregiver. Kamsler raised this with Bach. They met at Bach's office in Manhattan, away from Beth Israel, to discuss the situation frankly. Kamsler said the numbers were extraordinary. Bach agreed. Kamsler said it looked like exploitation, regardless of Huguette's insistence otherwise. Bach said it might look that way, but Huguette was competent and clear about her intentions. Kamsler asked what would happen when she died, and the relatives discovered what had been given to a nurse. Bach said there would almost certainly be litigation. Kamsler asked if they should try harder to discourage her. Bach said they had tried. She did not listen. They discussed the ethics of their position. Both men were being paid substantial fees to manage Huguette's affairs. Bach's law firm received over $300,000 annually. Kamsler's accounting firm received similar amounts. They benefited from the arrangement continuing, which created its own conflict. If they pushed too hard against Huguette's wishes regarding Perry, she might fire them and hire advisors more willing to do exactly as she asked. If they did nothing, they risked looking complicit in what might later be determined to be undue influence. They chose to continue. They would document everything carefully, maintain records showing they had raised concerns, and process whatever Huguette requested. It was the conservative choice, the professionally safe choice, and probably the choice that served their own interests as much as hers. The will underwent another major revision in 2009. This version eliminated the Corcoran bequest entirely. Huguette had grown angry with the museum over a disagreement about how some of her father's paintings were being displayed. She redirected that money, roughly $50 million worth of art, to a foundation she wanted created after her death. The foundation would maintain Bellosguardo as a museum dedicated to the arts. It would be funded with $100 million from her estate and would operate in perpetuity, preserving her father's house exactly as it existed. Bach pointed out several problems with this plan. First, Bellosguardo had been empty for 18 years and required millions in deferred maintenance. Second, creating and operating a private museum required enormous ongoing funding that $100 million might not sustain. Third, Santa Barbara already had museums, and there was no clear demand for another one dedicated to a house most people had never heard of. Fourth, the foundation would need trustees, staff, a mission statement, public programming, infrastructure that did not currently exist. Huguette dismissed all of these concerns. She said the foundation would be created, Bellosguardo would be preserved, and the details would be handled by whoever managed the estate after her death. Bach said that was not how foundations worked. They required planning, structure, legal frameworks established before death, not after. She said he should create whatever frameworks were necessary. He did, drafting documents that outlined a foundation whose feasibility he privately doubted. Perry's bequest increased again. The 2009 will left her $30 million plus the option to purchase one of the Fifth Avenue apartments at below market value. Kamsler calculated that the total value to Perry, including the gifts already given, now exceeded $50 million. He prepared a memo outlining his concerns and filed it with Bach's office. Neither man presented the memo to Huguette. They simply documented their objections and continued processing her instructions. The relatives knew nothing about any of this. Huguette had not contacted them in decades, had not responded to the occasional letters some of them sent, had given no indication that she remembered they existed. They assumed, reasonably, that they would inherit nothing, or that whatever she left would go to charity. None of them knew about Perry, about the gifts, about the will being revised repeatedly to transfer tens of millions to a nurse. By 2010, Huguette was 104 years old. She had lived at Beth Israel for 19 years. Bach and Kamsler knew that her death could come at any time, and when it did, the will they had helped construct would trigger legal battles that might take years to resolve. They had documented everything. They had raised concerns internally. They had done what they believed was professionally required. Whether they had done what was ethically right remained a question neither of them asked directly. Huguette's health began failing in early 2010. Not dramatically. There was no sudden crisis, no acute medical event that required intervention. Instead, her body simply started the slow process of shutting down that comes at the end of extreme age. She was 103 years old, and for the first time since arriving at Beth Israel in 1991, she actually needed to be in a hospital. She stopped eating regularly. Meals arrived on trays, prepared to her specifications, and returned to the kitchen, mostly untouched. Perry tried offering different foods, smaller portions, things Huguette had previously enjoyed. Nothing worked. She would take a few bites, then push the tray away, saying she was not hungry. Her weight, already low, dropped to 90 pounds, then 85, then 80. The doctors recommended a feeding tube. She refused. She stopped painting. The easel remained set up in the corner of room 3K, supplies organized on the desk, but she no longer had the strength to hold a brush steady for the extended periods her work required. She would sit at the desk sometimes, looking at unfinished watercolors, then return to her chair without adding anything. The paintings accumulated dust, their edges curling slightly in the dry hospital air. The dolls remained. They covered every available surface, shelves Perry had installed over the years, the windowsill, the top of the unused hospital bed. Huguette still rearranged them occasionally, moving one from a shelf to the desk, adjusting another's clothing, positioning them in configurations that made sense only to her. But the movements were slower now, more effortful. What had once been a daily occupation became weekly, then sporadic. She began sleeping most of the day, not the intentional sleep of someone resting, but the involuntary unconsciousness of a body conserving energy it no longer possessed. Perry would find her asleep in her chair at 10 in the morning, still asleep at 2 in the afternoon, waking briefly around 5, then sleeping again through the night. The distinction between day and night, already meaningless in a room where curtains remained permanently drawn, disappeared entirely. Dr. Newman, who had examined her when she first arrived in 1991 and had continued as her nominal physician for 19 years, told Perry that Huguette was dying, not from any specific illness, but from the cumulative failure of systems that had functioned for over a century. Her heart was weak. Her kidneys were failing. Her lungs were not processing oxygen efficiently. She could live weeks or months, but not years. Did she want to discuss end-of-life care preferences? Perry relayed the question. Huguette said no. Perry asked if she wanted any medical interventions if her condition worsened. Huguette said she wanted to be left alone. Perry asked if there was anyone she wanted to contact. Family, friends, anyone from her past. Huguette said there was no one. Perry asked if she was afraid. Huguette said no, she was tired. The hospital staff who had worked on the 3rd floor for years and had grown accustomed to Huguette's presence noticed the change. Room 3. Kay, always quiet, became absolutely silent. Perry no longer played muted television. Huguette no longer shuffled around, rearranging dolls or organizing supplies. The room existed in a stillness that felt less like peace than suspension, a space where someone was waiting for something inevitable, but not quite arrived. Bach called weekly to check on her condition. Perry gave brief updates. She was sleeping more, eating less, growing weaker. He asked if she was still mentally competent. Perry said yes when she was awake. He asked if she had mentioned changing her will again. Perry said no. He asked Perry to call him immediately if Huguette's condition deteriorated significantly. Perry said she would. Kamsler stopped calling. He had managed Huguette's finances for 42 years, processing millions in transactions, maintaining properties she never saw, funding an existence that made sense only within its own internal logic. Now there was nothing to manage. The accounts continued generating income, the bills continued being paid, but Huguette no longer made requests or gave instructions. His job had become purely administrative, maintaining systems that would continue until they were no longer needed. In August 2010, Huguette developed pneumonia. Her lungs, already weak, could not fight the infection effectively. Dr. Newman prescribed antibiotics and increased monitoring. The medication worked initially. Her fever decreased, her breathing improved slightly, but the underlying weakness remained. Newman told Perry that pneumonia often returned in patients this fragile, and the next infection might be the one she could not survive. Huguette seemed indifferent to this information. She took the medications Perry gave her without question or complaint. She allowed nurses to check her vital signs without protest, but she showed no interest in recovery, no desire to fight the infection beyond accepting whatever treatment was offered. She existed in a state of profound passivity, allowing her body to be maintained, but investing no will in its continuation. She gave Perry another gift in September, $3 million, transferred through Kamsler's office with the same efficiency that had characterized all previous gifts. It was the largest single payment yet. Perry accepted it, as she had accepted all the others, with brief thanks and no discussion. The money appeared in her account 3 days later. She did not call to confirm receipt. Huguette did not ask if it had arrived. The transaction occurred in the same silence that now characterized everything in room 3K. By October, Huguette was rarely conscious. She would wake for brief periods, 10 minutes, sometimes 20, then drift back into sleep that looked increasingly like something deeper. Perry sat in the corner, watching, waiting, maintaining the presence she had been paid millions to provide. Other nurses rotated through during Perry's off hours, but Huguette barely acknowledged them. She seemed to recognize Perry, or at least recognize her as the familiar presence, the constant element in a room that had become the entire world. The dolls watched from their shelves. The paintings sat unfinished on the desk. The hospital bed, still covered with books and supplies, remained unused. Outside room 3K, Beth Israel Medical Center continued its normal operations. Patients admitted, treated, discharged. The cycle of illness and recovery playing out in rooms identical to the one where Huguette had spent 19 years, avoiding both. On October 15, 2010, she briefly woke and asked Perry what day it was. Perry told her. Huguette said nothing for a moment, then said it was the anniversary of her sister's death. Andre had died 91 years earlier, in 1919, and Huguette had remembered the date every year since. Perry asked if she wanted to talk about her sister. Huguette said no. She closed her eyes and did not speak again for 3 days. Huguette Clark died on May 24, 2011, at 10:32 in the morning. Hadassah Perry was in the room. No one else was present. There had been no final gathering, no deathbed reconciliation, no relatives called to say goodbye. She simply stopped breathing while Perry sat in the corner reading a magazine. And when Perry looked up 15 minutes later, she realized it had happened. The death certificate listed the cause as old age and natural causes. She was 104 years and 349 days old. She had spent the final 7,300 days of her life in room 3K, a space measuring approximately 200 square feet, which meant she had occupied roughly 1.46 million square feet of time in that room, time that could have been spent in the mansion at Bellosguardo, or the 12 apartments on Fifth Avenue, or anywhere else in a world she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. The hospital notified Wallace Bach. He notified Irving Kamsler. Together they notified the distant relatives, 19 of them, descendants of W.A. Clark's children from his first marriage, scattered across the country. Most of them had not known Huguette was still alive. Several had assumed she died years earlier. One of them, a grandniece named Corinne McCall, later said she received the news while grocery shopping and had to pull over in the parking lot because she could not remember who Huguette Clark was. The will was filed for probate 3 days later. The relatives received copies and discovered that Huguette had left them nothing. The entire estate, valued at approximately $308 million, was directed elsewhere. The Bellosguardo Foundation would receive $85 million to maintain the Santa Barbara estate as a museum. Various smaller charities would receive $20 million combined. Hadassah Perry would receive $30 million, plus the option to purchase an apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue for $1 million, roughly one-third of its market value. The relatives hired attorneys within a week. The legal challenge was predictable and probably inevitable. They argued that Huguette had been mentally incompetent when signing the most recent will, that Perry had exercised undue influence, that Bach and Kamsler had failed in their fiduciary duties by allowing the situation to continue. They demanded the will be thrown out and the estate distributed according to intestacy laws, which would give them everything. The case became public in July 2011. Newspapers ran stories about the copper heiress who lived for decades in a hospital room, the nurse who received millions, the empty mansions maintained at extraordinary cost. The narrative wrote itself. Eccentric recluse, greedy caregiver, negligent advisors, hungry relatives. Every version of the story was incomplete, but incompleteness did not prevent coverage. Huguette became more famous in death than she had ever been in life. Her face, or rather the absence of her face since no photographs existed from the last 80 years, appearing in articles that described her as tragic, exploited, mentally ill, or all three. Room 3K was emptied in June. Hospital staff packed the dolls into boxes, removed the paintings, dismantled the shelves. The furniture Huguette had brought from her Fifth Avenue apartments was put into storage with the rest of her possessions. The room was cleaned, repainted, and returned to normal hospital use. A patient with an actual medical condition moved in 3 weeks after Huguette's death. The space remembered nothing. Bello Sguardo remained empty. The staff continued their routines for several months while the estate went through probate. Gardeners maintained the grounds, housekeepers cleaned the rooms, bills were paid from estate accounts. But uncertainty about the property's future made long-term planning impossible. Several staff members quit, finding employment elsewhere. Those who remained worked in an atmosphere of suspended animation, maintaining a property that might become a museum, might be sold, might continue sitting empty for years while lawyers argued. The Fifth Avenue apartments stayed locked. The co-op board, relieved that Huguette was dead and the situation might finally be resolved, waited to see what would happen. The building staff continued their monthly cleanings, but they stopped replacing light bulbs, stopped doing minor repairs. The apartments began showing visible neglect. Dust accumulated faster than cleaning schedules could manage. Paint chips went unfixed. Small problems that would have been addressed immediately for a living owner were deferred for an estate in litigation. The furniture in storage remained wrapped. The paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects Huguette had purchased over decades stayed in climate-controlled facilities, each item cataloged and appraised, but none displayed or used. The estate's lawyers hired specialists to value everything. The doll collection alone required 3 months to assess properly. Over 500 dolls, some worth thousands, a few worth tens of thousands, all meticulously maintained, all now orphaned. The legal battle consumed 2 years. Depositions were taken from everyone involved: Perry, Bach, Kamsler, hospital staff, estate employees. Perry was questioned for 16 hours over 3 days about her relationship with Huguette, the gifts she received, whether she had requested money or merely accepted what was offered. She maintained that Huguette had been generous voluntarily, that she had never asked for anything beyond her nursing salary. The relatives' attorneys presented the timeline of gifts, $31 million transferred over 18 years, and suggested that no reasonable person would give such amounts without pressure or manipulation. Bach and Kamsler were questioned about why they had not intervened more aggressively. They presented their internal memos documenting concerns, their attempts to structure the gifts differently, their repeated confirmations of Huguette's mental competence. The relatives' attorneys argued this was insufficient, that any reasonable professional would have recognized undue influence and refused to process the transactions. Bach and Kamsler responded that Huguette was their client, legally competent, and entitled to distribute her money as she wished. The case settled in September 2013. Neither side got what they wanted. The relatives received $34.5 million split among 19 people, approximately $1.8 million each, far less than the $308 million estate, but more than the nothing Huguette had intended. Perry received $5 million, a fraction of the $30 million bequest, but still an extraordinary amount for a nurse. She was also required to return $5 million of the gifts Huguette had given her during life. The settlement's implicit acknowledgement that something improper had occurred, even if it could not be precisely defined or prosecuted. Bach and Kamsler were removed as estate executors and agreed to reduce their fees. The public administrator of New York County took over managing the distribution. The Bello Sguardo Foundation received its funding, though the amount was reduced to $65 million, and the foundation would have to operate within strict guidelines designed to prevent the kind of waste the entire estate represented. The settlement distributed Huguette's fortune, according to formulas designed to balance competing claims of fairness. But it could not answer the questions that made her life disturbing rather than merely sad. What had she been protecting herself from? What had she believed the isolation would provide? What did she imagine happened in the world she spent 80 years avoiding? The estate sale occurred in 2014. Christie's and Sotheby's auctioned the contents: paintings, furniture, dolls, jewelry, everything that could be monetized. Collectors bought French antiques for their aesthetic value, unaware they had spent decades in storage. Museums acquired paintings from Huguette Clark's collection, adding them to galleries where people would finally see them. The dolls sold to other collectors who would arrange them on different shelves, dress them in different costumes, photograph them for different albums. Bellasguardo opened as a museum in 2016 after $12 million in repairs. Bellasguardo opened as a museum in 2016 after $12 million in repairs. Visitors walk through rooms Huguette never used, looking at furniture she never sat in, admiring views she stopped seeing decades before her death. The estate hosts concerts and gardens that were maintained for over 20 years without anyone walking through them. Tour guides describe W.A. Clark's copper empire, the mansion's construction, the family's history. They mention Huguette briefly, the daughter who inherited everything and occupied nothing, who spent her final decades in a hospital room while this house sat empty 3,000 miles away. The guides do not explain why, neither did the lawyers, the doctors, the relatives who fought over her money, or the journalists who wrote about her after she died. The explanations offered: mental illness, eccentricity. Trauma from her sister's death are words that describe without clarifying. They name the condition, but not its nature. Huguette spent her entire adult life constructing barriers between herself and a world she never specified was dangerous. No one harmed her. No scandal forced her retreat. She inherited extraordinary wealth and used it to purchase distance layer after layer until she existed in a space so compressed that a hospital room felt appropriately sized. The fortune that could have bought anything bought, instead, nothing. Empty apartments, empty houses, rooms cleaned for decades without being entered, furniture stored without being used. The relatives received their settlements and disappeared back into ordinary life. Perry kept the $5 million and returned to private nursing. Bach and Kamsler continued their practices, representing other wealthy clients with complicated estates. Beth Israel Medical Center converted room 3K back into normal rotation. None of them gained clarity about what they had witnessed or participated in. They had been present for something, but what that something was remained undefined. The wealth Huguette inherited was built on copper extracted from Montana earth, on labor controlled and exploited, on political machinery purchased and deployed. Her father used that wealth to construct monuments to his own existence, mansions, galleries, a Senate seat. She used it to construct her own erasure. Both projects succeeded completely. Both left behind structures that outlasted their architects, but explained nothing about the people who built them. The dolls sold at auction are in private collections now, arranged on other people's shelves, their glass eyes reflecting different rooms. They witnessed everything and reveal nothing.